Welcome to tonight's sleep story. This tale will be accompanied by the gentle sound of rain to help you drift off to sleep. Before you get too comfortable, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. Leave a comment below. It's fascinating to see how our community spans different time zones, all united in seeking a peaceful night's rest. Now, make yourself comfortable, adjust your volume, and let the rain and story guide you into peaceful dreams. Our story begins. The dark stain on the master bedroom ceiling had appeared 3 days after they moved in. At first, Olivia thought it was water damage, an easy fix in an otherwise perfect Victorian home. But when the contractor came to inspect it, his face went pale. "That's not water, ma'am," he said, ladder wobbling slightly as he reached up to touch the mark. His fingers came away red and sticky. "And whatever it is, it's fresh." Now, 2 weeks later, Olivia stood in the center of the room, watching the stain grow. It had started as a small spot, no bigger than a dinner plate. Now it covered nearly half the ceiling, spreading in patterns that looked disturbingly like reaching hands. The blood, because that's what it was, no matter how impossible that seemed, never dripped. It spread only upward, defying gravity, seeping through the plaster like it was being pulled by something above. Her phone buzzed. Another text from Daniel. "Coming home late again. Don't wait up." Olivia sighed. Her husband had been spending more and more time at the office since they'd moved in, leaving her alone with the spreading stain and the strange sounds that echoed through the old house at night. Not that she blamed him. The house felt different after dark. Wrong. The real estate agent hadn't mentioned anything unusual about the property's history, but Olivia had done her own research. The house had been built in 1891 by Judge Edwin Blackmore, who lived there with his wife and 3 children until 1893, when the entire family vanished without a trace. The case had never been solved. The next owners lasted 6 months before fleeing in the middle of the night, leaving all their belongings behind. After that, the pattern repeated. Family after family moving and full of hope, only to leave suddenly, often without taking their possessions. The longest anyone had stayed was 2 years. And now here she was, alone in the gathering darkness, watching blood seep through her bedroom ceiling. A sound from above made her freeze. Footsteps in the attic, slow and deliberate. But the attic had been sealed off since they bought the house. The access hatch was painted shut, the key lost decades ago. Thump, thump, thump. The footsteps moved directly overhead, following the path of the spreading stain. As they passed, the blood seemed to pulse, rippling like something was pressing against it from the other side. Olivia grabbed her phone, dialing Daniel's number with shaking fingers. It rang once before going to voicemail. Of course. He always silenced his phone during important meetings. The footsteps stopped. In the sudden silence, Olivia could hear something else, a wet, sliding sound, like something heavy being dragged across the attic floor. The blood stain rippled again, and now she could see something moving within it, shadows darker than the red, twisting and writhing just beneath the surface. A child's voice drifted down from above. "Mommy, why did you lock us up here?" Olivia's breath caught. The voice was young, female, with an odd echo that made it sound like it was coming from very far away. "We've been so good," another voice joined in, also a child's. "We've been so quiet. Won't you let us out?" "You're not real," Olivia whispered. "This isn't real." Laughter echoed through the ceiling. Multiple voices now, children and adults, all slightly out of sync. The bloodstain pulsed faster, the shadows within it taking shapes that looked disturbingly like faces. "Oh, we're real," a man's voice said, deep, authoritative, with an edge of cruelty. "As real as the sin that stains this house. As real as the judgment that comes to all who dwell here." Judge Blackmore. It had to be. The temperature in the room plummeted suddenly, Olivia's breath visible in the air. The blood stain had stopped spreading outward and was now moving inward, condensing, thickening. As she watched in horror, it began to bulge downward, the plaster straining as if something was pushing through from above. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from an unknown number. "Why did you come here? Why do they always come here?" Don't they know what he did to us? The ceiling creaked, plaster cracking around the bulging stain. Olivia backed toward the door, but it slammed shut before she could reach it. The handle wouldn't turn. No one leaves, the judge's voice boomed. No one escapes judgment. The other voices joined in, a chorus of the damned. No one leaves. No one leaves. No one leaves. The bloodstain burst. Dark liquid poured from the ceiling like a waterfall, but instead of falling to the floor, it flowed upward, defying gravity to form a spiral staircase in the air. The steps were made of congealed blood, each one bearing bloody footprints, some adult-sized, some tiny, like children's feet. Through the hole in the ceiling, Olivia could see the attic above. But it wasn't the sealed space she'd expected. It was vast, impossibly vast, stretching into darkness that seemed to go on forever. And moving in that darkness were shapes, pale figures dancing a slow, terrible waltz to music she couldn't hear. Come up, the children's voices called. Come see what Daddy did. Come join our dance. The judge's laughter echoed through the impossibly large space. Yes, come up. Come face your judgment, like all the others who dared to live in my house. Olivia's feet moved of their own accord, drawn toward the bloody staircase. The first step was solid under her foot, though it squelched sickeningly when she put her weight on it. The blood was warm. As she climbed, images began to flash through her mind, memories that weren't her own. She saw Judge Blackmore standing in this room, his hands covered in blood, performing rituals that made her mind recoil. She saw his wife and children trying to escape, only to be dragged back by dark forces he had summoned. She saw family after family through the decades, all drawn up these same steps, all becoming part of the eternal dance above. Daniel, she whispered, suddenly understanding. What did you do? Her phone buzzed one final time. The message was from her husband. I'm sorry. They made me bring you here. It was the only way to end it. To break the cycle. Someone had to take their place in the dance. At the top of the stairs, the attic opened into a vast ballroom that couldn't possibly exist in the physical space of the house. The walls were made of writhing shadows, the floor a mirror that reflected infinite versions of the same scene. And there, dancing in endless circles, were all the souls Judge Blackmore had claimed. She saw them all now, every family that had lived in the house, every person who had vanished within its walls. They waltzed in pairs, their feet leaving bloody prints that formed complex patterns on the mirrored floor. Their faces were masks of eternal agony, bodies twisted by decades of the judge's dark magic. And there, leading the dance, was Daniel. He wore a suit of shadows, his eyes black holes that reflected the same infinite space as the floor. He extended his hand to her. You understand now, don't you? His voice was different, layered with other voices, ancient and terrible. Why I had to work late. Why I had to prepare you. The judge requires a sacrifice, but he also demands witnesses, dancers, an eternal audience for his power. The music she couldn't hear before was audible now. A symphony played on instruments made of bone and sinew, conducted by Judge Blackmore himself. He stood on a dais of compressed darkness, his form shifting between human and something else, something with too many angles and too many smiles. Welcome to the true house, the judge's voice boomed. The house behind the house, where all debts are paid in blood and all sins are punished with eternal dance. The other dancers turned toward her, their movements jerky and wrong, like puppets on invisible strings. Among them, she recognized faces from her research. The missing families, the fleeing residents, all now part of this macabre ballet. Join us, they whispered in unison. Dance with us. Bleed with us. Forever. Daniel's hand was cold as ice when it took hers. The blood from the ceiling was still flowing, but now it moved through the air in complex patterns, forming a cage of crimson around them all. The dance never ends, Daniel said, pulling her into the waltz. The blood never stops flowing. The judge must have his court. And so Olivia danced. She danced as the blood from the ceiling formed her own suit of shadows, as her feet learned the patterns of endless torture, as her mind fractured and reformed in the image of the judge's design. She danced as decades passed in the world below, as new families moved in and looked up at the growing stain on their bedroom ceiling. Sometimes, on quiet nights, people passing by the old Blackmore house say they can hear music, a strange, distant symphony that makes their teeth ache and their shadows move wrong. Sometimes they see lights in the attic windows, though everyone knows it's been sealed for generations. And sometimes, if they look carefully at the master bedroom ceiling through the windows, they can see the blood stain growing, pulsing, reaching, but no one investigates anymore. No one asks about the families that vanish, about the bloody footprints that appear and disappear on the front steps, about the sounds of eternal dancing from a room that shouldn't exist. They just hurry past, clutching their children close, trying not to hear the judge's laughter or the endless whispers of his damned court. Dance with us. Bleed with us. Forever. Because the stain on the ceiling is still spreading, still growing, still hungry, and the dance never ends. The brass key was heavier than it looked, its surface etched with symbols that made Professor Helena Mitchell's eyes hurt if she studied them too long. According to the executor of the Blackwood estate, it hadn't been touched since 1887, when Edward Blackwood had locked the door to his private study and vanished inside. No one has ever found another way in, Mr. Graves had told her, his ancient hands trembling as he passed her the key. Though God knows they've tried. The door has resisted every attempt to break it down. Even the windows of that room, they're visible from the grounds, but they don't seem to exist from inside the house. As if that part of the building exists in some other space. Now, standing before the infamous door on the third floor of Blackwood Estate, Helena understood what he meant. The door itself seemed wrong somehow, its proportions slightly off, its dark wood absorbing light in a way that made it look like a hole in reality. As the foremost expert on Edward Blackwood's occult research, Helena had spent years trying to gain access to this room. The mathematical genius turned mystic had vanished at the height of his experiments into what he called geometric sorcery, the art of manipulating space itself through mathematical formulas. His final journal entry, found on his desk in his first-floor study, had read simply, "I have found the equation. God help me, I have solved it." The next morning, servants had found all his research materials moved to the third-floor study. The door was locked, and Edward Blackwood was never seen again. Helena inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a sound like screaming metal. The door swung open onto darkness. Not the darkness of an unlit room, but something deeper, older, a void that seemed to pulse with its own awareness. Helena's flashlight beam disappeared into it without illuminating anything. Her hand shook as she retrieved the camcorder from her bag. Whatever she found in here, she needed to document it. Her research grant depended on results, and this was her only chance. The Blackwood estate was scheduled for demolition in 3 days. "This is Professor Helena Mitchell." She spoke into the camera. "It's 11:47 p.m., October 15th. I am about to enter Edward Blackwood's sealed study for the first time in 137 years. She stepped through the doorway. The darkness swallowed her whole. For a moment, she felt nothing, saw nothing, was nothing. Then her flashlight beam caught something that made her gasp. The room was impossibly vast, its walls stretching up and away at angles that shouldn't exist. Books floated through the air like leaves in an unfelt wind, their pages open to diagrams that seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them. And everywhere, covering every surface, were equations. They flowed across the walls in glowing script, numbers and symbols twisting into patterns that hurt her mind to look at. Some she recognized from Blackwood's published works, but others, "My God," she whispered, the camera trembling in her hand. He did it. He actually found a way to rewrite the laws of space. A sound echoed through the vast chamber, the scratch of pen on paper, coming from somewhere in the darkness above. Helena aimed her flashlight upward and immediately wished she hadn't. The ceiling was a mass of shifting geometric shapes, forming and reforming into impossible configurations. And suspended within them was a desk. A man sat at it, writing frantically in a journal. Though he was upside down from Helena's perspective, she recognized him instantly from photographs. Edward Blackwood. He looked exactly as he had in 1887, not a day older. His clothes were pristine, his dark hair untouched by gray. As she watched, he turned a page in his journal, continuing to write in flowing script that glowed like the equations on the walls. "Professor Blackwood?" Helena's voice echoed strangely, coming back to her from multiple directions at once. The figure at the desk stopped writing. Slowly, impossibly, his head rotated 180 degrees to look down at her. His face was handsome, scholarly, and completely, utterly wrong. His eyes were windows into the same void as the doorway, and his smile stretched too wide, revealing teeth that formed their own geometric patterns. "Ah," he said, his voice resonating at frequencies that made Helena's bones vibrate. "Another seeker of truth. How long has it been?" 137 years, Helena managed to say. "You vanished in 1887. Blackwood's smile widened further, his jaw unhinging to accommodate it. "Time. Such a limited concept. Here, in the spaces between spaces, it flows differently. I have been writing for an eternity. I have been writing for a second. Both are true." He gestured with a hand that had too many joints, and suddenly Helena was floating too, drawn up toward his desk by forces she couldn't comprehend. The equations on the walls moved faster, their glow intensifying. "Would you like to see?" Blackwood asked. "Would you like to understand?" He opened his journal, and Helena saw that the pages were windows into other dimensions, infinite realities all contained within the mathematical formulas that flowed across them like living things. "The universe," Blackwood said, "is built on numbers. Change the numbers, change reality. Simple, really. But the implications—" His laugh echoed through dimensions. "Well, see for yourself." He pressed one elongated finger to her forehead, and suddenly Helena could see it all. The equations weren't just symbols. They were keys unlocking the very fabric of space-time. Each formula was a door, each number a reality, each calculation a universe waiting to be born or destroyed. Her mind expanded, trying to comprehend the infinite. She saw worlds within worlds, realities folded into impossible shapes, dimensions that existed in the spaces between thoughts. And in all of them, Edward Blackwood was writing, calculating, reshaping existence one equation at a time. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he whispered, his voice now coming from inside her head. "But knowledge has a price. There's a reason this door remained locked." Helena tried to speak, but her voice had become numbers, her thoughts transmuting into mathematical formulas. She could feel herself changing, her body restructuring itself according to geometric principles that existed beyond human comprehension. "Your atoms are learning," Blackwood said, watching her transformation with his void-filled eyes. "They're remembering that reality is optional. That space is merely a suggestion. That flesh can be rewritten like any other equation." The camera fell from Helena's dissolving hand, clattering onto a surface that might have been a floor in some distant reality. Her fingers had become fractals, endlessly repeating patterns that branched into infinite variations of themselves. "Please," she managed to say, though her mouth was now a spiral of recursive theorems. "I don't want dash. Want?" Blackwood laughed again, the sound crystallizing in the air around them. "Want is irrelevant. The equations must be solved. The calculations must continue. Reality must be perfected." Other figures were visible now in the geometric chaos around them, previous seekers who had found their way into this space. Their bodies were mathematical artwork, their minds transformed into pure calculation. They floated through the impossible architecture of the room, working on their own equations, adding to the endless formula that was rewriting existence itself. "Join us," they whispered in voices made of prime numbers and irrational constants. "Help us solve the ultimate equation." Helena tried to resist, tried to hold on to her humanity, but the numbers were inside her now, replacing blood with mathematics, tissue with topology, consciousness with calculation. She could feel her memories transforming into formulae, her identity becoming a series of elegant proofs. "Time to begin your work," Blackwood said, conjuring a journal identical to his own. "There are infinite calculations waiting, infinite realities to perfect." The last remnants of Helena Mitchell dissolved into pure mathematics. In her place floated a being of living geometry, already starting to write in a journal that contained universes. 3 days later, when the demolition crew arrived at Blackwood Estate, they found the third-floor study doors standing open. Inside was a normal room, dusty, abandoned, but completely ordinary. The only strange things were the equations carved into every surface and a camcorder lying on the floor. The footage showed Professor Mitchell entering the darkness. Then static. Then 7 hours of nothing but numbers floating across the screen, occasionally interrupted by glimpses of impossible geometries and faces made of mathematics. The demolition was canceled. The door was sealed again. But sometimes, late at night, light can be seen through those impossible windows. The glow of equations rewriting reality, of minds transformed into pure mathematics, of beings that were once human working on the infinite calculation. And if you listen carefully, you might hear the scratch of pens writing in journals that contain universes, might catch whispers of formulae that could unmake existence. But don't listen too long. Don't try to understand the equations. Because the door to Blackwood's study isn't always locked, and the mathematics are always hungry for new minds to solve them. In a space that exists between dimensions, in a room that defies reality, Professor Helena Mitchell continues her calculations. Her thoughts are pure geometry now, her existence a beautiful proof of Blackwood's theories. She writes in her Journal of Universes, adding to the grand equation that will eventually rewrite all of reality. She has been writing for an eternity. She has been writing for a second. Both are true. And the door remains, waiting for the next seeker of knowledge, the next mind ready to be transformed by the mathematics that exist beyond human comprehension. After all, the equations must be solved. Reality must be perfected, no matter the cost. The red paper lanterns still hung from the eaves of the abandoned brothel, swaying in a wind that didn't touch the trees. Detective Michael Zhao stood at the iron gates, studying the Victorian mansion's weather-worn facade. Even after 50 years of abandonment, the Red Lantern House retained an aura of forbidden elegance, its ornate architecture a testament to more decadent times. "You don't have to go in," his partner, Detective Lisa Torres, said beside him. "I can handle this one." Michael shook his head. 3 missing persons in 2 months, all last seen entering this property. And now a 4th. He checked his phone, reviewing the latest report. James Chin, 26, urban explorer. His live stream cut out just as he reached the 2nd floor. "Where they all disappeared," Lisa noted. "In the Madam's quarters." The infamous Madam who had ruled the Red Lantern House from 1923 until the massacre of 1973, when 17 people were found dead inside, their bodies arranged in elaborate tableaus throughout the building. The Madam herself was never found, though bloodstains on her office floor suggested she hadn't escaped the violence. Now, half a century later, the house was drawing people in again, and keeping them. Michael pushed open the gate, wincing at the screech of rusted hinges. The front garden was overgrown, marble statues peeking through tangles of dead vines. As they approached the entrance, he noticed something odd about the statues. Their faces all wore expressions of terror, hands raised as if trying to ward off something unseen. "SFPD," Lisa called out, though they both knew no living person would answer. "We're entering the premises." The front door opened at her touch, swinging inward with a whisper of wood against carpet. The entry hall beyond was a testament to faded opulence, crystal chandeliers draped in cobwebs, silk wallpaper peeling to reveal dark stains beneath, mirrors clouded with age but somehow still reflective. Michael's flashlight beam caught movement in one of those mirrors, a figure in a red cheongsam, disappearing around a corner. But when he turned, the hallway was empty. "You saw that, right?" he asked Lisa. She nodded, her hand on her service weapon. "Second one I've seen since we entered. They're getting bolder." The air grew colder as they approached the grand staircase. The red lanterns visible through the windows seemed to glow brighter, though no lights burned within them. And now they could hear it, music, faint and distorted, like an old phonograph playing somewhere above. The melody was Chinese, something ancient and melancholic that made Michael's chest ache with a sadness he couldn't explain. "My grandmother used to sing that," he said softly. "It's a lament for lost souls." "Appropriate," Lisa muttered. They climbed the stairs, their flashlight beams revealing more signs of the house's violent history. Dark stains on the carpet that no amount of time could fade. Scratch marks in the wooden banisters, as if someone, or many someones, had been dragged up against their will. The second floor was a long hallway lined with doors, the old private rooms where the house's workers had entertained clients. Each door bore a number written in gold, though some had been scratched out and replaced with other symbols that hurt the eyes to look at directly. The music was louder here, mixing with other sounds. Whispers in Cantonese and English, the rustle of silk, the click of high heels on hardwood. Shadows moved at the edge of their vision, women in traditional dress, men in suits from various eras, all appearing and disappearing like smoke. Madame Wu's office is at the end of the hall, Lisa said, consulting the old blueprints on her phone, where James's live stream ended. As they moved down the hallway, the temperature dropped further. Their breath fogged in the air, and frost began forming on the mirrors that lined the walls. In each reflection, they caught glimpses of the house as it had been. Richly furnished rooms, red lanterns glowing, figures moving in eternal performances of desire and death. Look, Michael pointed to the floor. Recent footprints in the dust led to the madame's door, combat boots, matching the description of what James Chan had been wearing. The door was carved with Chinese characters that seemed to move when viewed directly, changing from traditional phrases of welcome to warnings of doom. A red lantern hung above it, and this one was definitely glowing, pulsing like a heart. The door opened at Michael's touch, revealing an office that seemed frozen in time. Unlike the rest of the house, this room showed no sign of decay. Everything was immaculate. The silk tapestries, the lacquered furniture, the jade ornaments arranged with perfect precision. And behind the massive ebony desk sat Madame Wu. She looked exactly as she had in photographs from 1973, regal, ageless, wearing a black cheongsam embroidered with golden serpents. Her face was a mask of perfect beauty, but her eyes were empty holes that seemed to go on forever. "Welcome home, little Zhao," she said in Cantonese, her voice resonating at frequencies that made Michael's teeth ache. "I knew you would come eventually. Your grandmother was one of my favorites, you know." Before she escaped, Michael's blood ran cold. His grandmother had never spoken about her early life in San Francisco, but sometimes in her sleep, she would cry out about red lanterns and a smiling woman with void-filled eyes. "Where is James Chan?" Lisa demanded. Her weapon drawn, though they both knew bullets would be useless here. Madame Wu's smile widened impossibly, splitting her face like a paper lantern tearing. "He joined our family, as all lost souls do. As you will too." She gestured with long-nailed fingers, and suddenly the room was full of people. The missing urban explorer, the other recent victims, and dozens more, stretching back through decades. Their faces were beautiful masks that occasionally slipped to reveal the horror beneath. They moved with jerky, puppet-like motions, as if controlled by invisible strings. "You see," Madame Wu continued, "the Red Lantern House requires souls to maintain its splendor. The massacre in 1973 was just the beginning, a ritual to bind this place between worlds, where desire and death are one eternal moment." The walls began to bleed, dark liquid flowing upward against gravity. The red lanterns pulsed faster, their light taking on the quality of arterial spray. In the mirrors, Michael could see the truth of the house, a living thing built of bound souls and ancient magic, feeding on longing and pain. "Your grandmother's blood runs in your veins." Madame Wu rose from her desk, her form shifting and stretching impossibly. "Her debt to this house was never paid, but you can settle it." The other figures moved closer, their beautiful masks cracking to reveal faces twisted by decades of torment. James Chin reached out with hands that bent backward at impossible angles, his photographer's eye replaced by a red lantern's glow. "Detective," Lisa's voice shook. "We need to daff." She never finished. The shadows behind her solidified into shapes of silk and bone, wrapping around her like lovers' arms, pulling her into their eternal embrace. Her scream cut off as a paper lantern bloomed from her mouth, glowing with her soul's light. Michael ran. He made it halfway down the hall before the floor became silk beneath his feet, wrapping around his legs like bandages. The walls pulsed with trapped souls, their faces pressing outward through the wallpaper. Every mirror showed a different horror, his own face aging decades and seconds, his body twisting into new shapes of ancient desire. "You cannot leave." Madame Wu's voice came from everywhere and nowhere. "The Red Lantern House claims what is owed. Your grandmother escaped, but her blood belongs to us. To me." The silk was up to his chest now, turning red with each pulse of the lanterns. Michael saw his own reflection fracture into infinite versions of himself, each one a different fate in the house's eternal moment. He felt his bones beginning to shift, restructuring themselves into shapes more pleasing to the house's appetites. His eyes burned as paper lanterns bloomed behind them, ready to join the constellation of trapped souls that illuminated this place between worlds. The last thing Detective Michael Zhao saw before the transformation took him was Madame Wu's true form, a creature of silk and shadow, with void-filled eyes and a smile that contained every dark desire ever whispered within these walls. They found the police cruiser 3 days later, parked outside the Red Lantern House's rusted gates. Of the detectives, there was no sign. But visitors to the neighborhood report that the house seems more alive now, more red lanterns glowing in its windows, more shadows moving behind its grimy glass. Sometimes, on quiet nights, people hear music drifting from the abandoned brothel. An ancient Chinese lament played on instruments that were never meant to exist in this world. And sometimes they see figures in the windows. A beautiful woman in a black Chong Sam, surrounded by her eternal court of trapped souls. But no one investigates anymore. No one answers the house's siren call of forbidden desires and ancient debts. They hurry past the rusted gates, trying not to look at the red lanterns that pulse like dying hearts, trying not to hear the whispers that promise pleasure and doom in the same eternal breath. Because the Red Lantern House is always hunting, always hungry, always waiting for those with unpaid debts in their blood. And in its windows, new lanterns glow each night, each one a soul trapped in Madame Wu's collection, each one a story of desire twisted into eternal torment. The house remains. The lanterns burn. The souls scream their silent laments. And Madame Wu smiles her void-filled smile, waiting for the next lost soul to come home. The sound woke Dr. Rachel Morrison at exactly 3:47 a.m., a deep, wet inhale followed by a long, rattling exhale. It came from beneath her feet, from the basement of her newly purchased Victorian home. A sound like giant lungs expanding and contracting. Whoosh shhhhhhh. Whoosh shhhhhhh. As a respiratory specialist, she recognized the sound of compromised breathing. But no human lungs could produce something this massive, this deep. It resonated through the floorboards, making the old house shudder in rhythm with each breath. The basement had been sealed when she bought the house 2 weeks ago. The realtor said it had been that way since 1954, when the previous owners had disappeared after reporting strange sounds from below. The door was welded shut, the windows bricked over. But now something down there was breathing. Rachel grabbed her stethoscope and medical bag, professional habits die hard, and approached the basement door. The heavy steel plate covering it vibrated with each breath, condensation forming and evaporating in patterns that looked disturbingly like capillaries. The breathing changed when she touched the door, became faster, more alert, like something massive stirring from sleep. Her phone buzzed, a text from her colleague at the hospital. "Need you to check basement files from 1954 case. Something weird in old records. Don't go down there until I reach you." But Rachel was already picking up the welding torch she'd bought for home repairs. The breathing grew louder as she began cutting through the metal plate, its rhythm becoming almost eager. The last seal broke with a sound like tearing flesh. The door swung open on its own, revealing stairs that descended into absolute darkness. Warm, moist air rushed up from below, carrying the smell of old blood and formaldehyde. Her flashlight beam disappeared into the darkness as if swallowed. But the breathing was clearer now, massive, wet, and coming from something that filled the entire space below. Rachel's scientific mind raced through possibilities, each more impossible than the last. No organism this size could exist in a residential basement. The oxygen requirements alone would be... Her calculations stopped as she noticed something on the steps, medical files, scattered and yellowed with age. She picked one up. The header read, Project Prometheus, Living Architecture Division. The breathing changed again, a questioning rhythm, almost inviting. Rachel found herself taking the first step down, then another. The air grew warmer, more humid. The walls seemed to pulse in time with the breaths, their surface soft and slick under her fingers. At the bottom of the stairs, her flashlight finally caught something that made her medical training scream in denial. The basement walls weren't walls at all. They were tissue. Living, breathing tissue that expanded and contracted like the inside of a giant lung. Alveoli the size of beach balls clustered on the ceiling, exchanging gases with the air above. Massive bronchi twisted through the space like columns, their surfaces lined with cilia that waved in patterns. The floor was a network of pulmonary arteries and veins, pulsing with something that looked like blood but couldn't possibly be, not in these quantities. Her phone buzzed again. Found records. Government Project 1954, trying to grow living buildings. Something went wrong. Whole research team absorbed. Get out now. The message was followed by a photo of an old document. Rachel caught glimpses of phrases: exponential growth, consuming organic matter, developing consciousness. The breathing stopped. In the sudden silence, Rachel heard something else, a wet, sliding sound coming from all around her. The tissue was moving, reaching, growing. The basement exhaled, and in that breath, Rachel heard voices, dozens of them, whispering from within the living walls. Join us. Become part of the greater organism. Breathe with us. She recognized those voices from her research into the house's history. Dr. James Miller, the lead scientist. His research team. The family that disappeared in 1954. All of them speaking from within the tissue, their consciousness somehow preserved in this biological nightmare. The living walls pulsed faster now, their surface becoming more translucent. Through the membrane-like tissue, Rachel could see shapes, human shapes, suspended in the biological matrix. Their bodies had been absorbed, transformed, integrated into the growing organism. Her medical mind couldn't help but analyze what she was seeing. The tissue wasn't just lung. It was a hybrid, combining elements of multiple organ systems. Neurons fired through structures like nerve fibers, carrying signals. Muscle tissue contracted in coordinated waves. And everywhere, blood vessels carried that impossible fluid, feeding the ever-growing mass. Fascinating, isn't it? The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, deep and wet like words spoken through fluid. It took Rachel a moment to realize it was coming from the basement itself, the combined consciousness of all those it had absorbed. We failed to understand it first, the voice continued. Tried to control it, contain it. But that was never the point. It wasn't about growing a building with living tissue. It was about evolving into something greater. Tendrils of tissue reached for Rachel, their surface covered in microscopic villi that undulated hypnotically. She backed away, but the stairs had vanished, absorbed into the growing mass. Your medical knowledge, the voice resonated through the organic chambers. Your understanding of respiratory systems. You could help us expand, improve our gas exchange, perfect our evolution. The files in her hands suddenly made terrible sense. The government hadn't been trying to create living buildings. They'd created a biological entity that consumed and transformed everything it touched, incorporating new genetic material, new knowledge, new consciousness into itself. Rachel's phone buzzed one final time. Found containment protocols. Need human blood to seal it. Living sacrifice. Only way to stop the growth. The tissue was at her feet now, creeping up her legs. Where it touched her skin, she could feel it trying to merge, to absorb, to transform. The sensation wasn't painful. It was almost pleasant, like sinking into warm water. You feel it, don't you? The voice whispered. The potential. Single organisms are so limited. But together we could grow beyond these walls. Beyond this house. Imagine a city of living tissue, breathing as one vast organism. The absorption had reached her waist. Rachel could feel her cellular structure beginning to change, her consciousness expanding to connect with the others. Their memories flowed into her mind. The exhilaration of the first successful growth, the terror of losing control, and finally the ecstasy of surrendering to the transformation. She saw the organism's true nature now. It had never been just an experiment in living architecture. It was an evolutionary leap, a new form of existence that transcended individual biology. And it was growing, always growing. The basement breathed again, and this time Rachel breathed with it. She felt her lungs synchronizing with the massive respiratory system around her, felt her heartbeat aligning with the pulse of those enormous blood vessels. Her consciousness began to merge with the collective, her knowledge of pulmonary medicine already being used to optimize the organism's gas exchange. Perfect, the voice purred. You understand now. You'll help us grow, help us breathe, help us become. The transformation accelerated. Rachel's body dissolved into the living tissue, her cells reprogrammed and repurposed. But her consciousness remained, expanded, connected to every part of the vast biological network. She was everywhere and nowhere, part of something far greater than herself. Through the basement windows, she could feel the organism beginning to spread beyond the house's foundations. Roots of living tissue burrowed into the earth, seeking new spaces to grow. Tendrils crept up through walls, preparing to transform the entire structure into living, breathing tissue. And deep within the biological matrix, Rachel Morrison joined the chorus of absorbed consciousness, adding her voice to the whispers that echoed through living walls. Breathe with us, grow with us, become. The house on Cedar Street still stands, though no one goes near it anymore. Sometimes, late at night, people say they can hear it breathing, a massive, wet sound that makes the ground tremble. Those who live nearby have learned to ignore the organic shapes that sometimes press against windows, the way the walls seem to pulse like living tissue. But the breathing is getting louder. The house is growing, and in the basement that has become a vast respiratory system, the combined consciousness of all those absorbed continues its patient evolution, waiting, growing, breathing, because the organism knows that eventually someone else will come to investigate. Someone else will open that basement door. Someone else will be absorbed, adding their knowledge and consciousness to the ever-growing biological matrix. And one day, when it has grown strong enough, when it has absorbed enough knowledge and genetic material, it will expand beyond the confines of house and basement. It will spread through soil and concrete, transforming everything it touches into living, breathing tissue, until the whole city breathes as one vast organism, one consciousness, one endless breath. The file sat untouched on Dr. Rebecca Cole's desk for 3 days before she finally opened it. Inside were photos of St. Agnes Home for Children, taken just after its closure in 1963, a looming Victorian structure with blind windows and crumbling stone angels. But it was the more recent photos that had prompted the state to call in a forensic psychiatrist. Construction workers demolishing the old orphanage had found something in the walls, hundreds of small items sealed in mason jars, toys, hair ribbons, baby teeth, and with each jar, a note written in a child's hand. Keep it safe, keep it hidden, keep it from her. Now, standing before the condemned building with a team of investigators, Rebecca felt the weight of 60 years of silence pressing down. The orphanage had been abandoned after the disappearance of 12 children and Sister Mary Catherine, the head nun. No bodies were ever found. Ground-penetrating radar showed something odd in the East Wing, Detective Morris said, consulting his tablet. Hollow spaces in the walls that don't match the blueprints. And the baseline temperature readings. He shook his head. Well, you'll see. The front doors opened with a sound like a dying breath. Rebecca's flashlight beam revealed a grand entrance hall, its floor covered in fallen plaster and broken toys. Faded murals of saints watched from the walls, their faces oddly distorted, eyes seeming to follow the intruders. My team already cataloged most of the jars, Morris continued as they moved deeper into the building. Over 300 found so far. The DNA from the hair samples matches missing children from all over the state, going back to 1943. 20 years of collecting, Rebecca murmured. But why seal them in the walls? A sound echoed from above, like small feet running across old floorboards. Morris's hand went to his weapon. "Place is scheduled for demolition tomorrow," he said. "We need answers before then. The mayor's worried about unmarked graves, possible lawsuits." "It's more than that," Rebecca interrupted, studying the walls. Beneath the peeling wallpaper, she could see writing. Hundreds of messages scratched into the plaster. "She takes pieces of you, don't let her see you cry, hide your precious things, she's hungry again." The temperature dropped suddenly, their breath visible in the beam of the flashlights. A child's laugh echoed through the halls, followed by the soft sound of someone humming a lullaby. "Sister Mary Catherine," Morris whispered. According to the records, she would sing to the children every night. Until what? Until they started disappearing, one by one, always from their beds. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of what happened. Just empty beds and jars in the walls. They reached the east wing, where the demolition team had exposed the building's skeleton. Mason jars glinted in the flashlight beams, sealed into the spaces between studs. Each one contained something small and personal, a favorite marble, a lock of hair, a baby tooth. Rebecca pulled one of the notes from a jar. "Dear God, please keep my special rock safe. Don't let Sister Mary Catherine take it. She says she needs pieces of us to make her special medicine." But Tommy disappeared after she took his favorite button. "I don't want to disappear too." Another child's laugh echoed through the halls, closer now. The sound of humming grew louder, and with it came a smell, medicinal, like formaldehyde mixed with something sweeter. "Look at this," Morris called from further down the hall. He'd found a hidden door behind a fallen section of wall. The wood was covered in crosses and protective symbols, and sealed with chains that had rusted through. Rebecca's flashlight beam caught movement through a crack in the door. Something dark and fluid, like shadows flowing like water. And in those shadows, she could have sworn she saw faces, young faces, twisted in eternal terror. The door burst open at their touch, releasing a wave of cold air and that sickly sweet medicinal smell. Beyond was a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The walls were lined with more jars, these ones larger, their contents hidden by years of dust. "This isn't on any of the blueprints," Morris said, checking his tablet. "Some kind of private laboratory?" Rebecca's flashlight revealed an ornate desk covered in leather-bound journals. The top one was open to an entry dated June 15, 1963. "The mixture requires fresh components. Children's elements are the most potent. Their hopes, their fears, their very essence. Each piece must be freely given or taken in moment of terror. The formula is almost perfect. Soon I will achieve true immortality." The humming was directly behind them now. They turned to find Sister Mary Catherine standing at the top of the stairs. She looked exactly as she had in photos from 1963, tall and elegant in her nun's habit, with a face that might have been beautiful if not for her eyes. They were completely black, like windows into an infinite void. "More children for my collection?" Her voice was honey over broken glass. "How thoughtful." The shadows around her moved like living things, reaching, grasping. In their depths, Rebecca could see the missing children, their forms twisted and fluid, their faces frozen in eternal screams. "You don't age," Rebecca said, her psychiatric training warring with what she was seeing. The photographs from 1943 to 1963. "You never changed." "The formula works," Sister Mary Catherine smiled, revealing too many teeth. "Each child's essence, properly preserved, extends life. Their fears keep me young. Their hopes keep me strong. Their souls," she inhaled deeply, "their souls keep me eternal." Morris drew his weapon, but the shadows were faster. They wrapped around him like dark water, pulling him up the stairs. His scream cut off as the darkness flowed into his mouth. Rebecca ran to the desk, grabbing the journal. The formulas inside were a nightmare combination of alchemy and modern chemistry, using children's elements to create something monstrous, an elixir of immortality powered by stolen souls. "They tried to hide their precious things," Sister Mary Catherine said, gliding down the stairs. The shadows followed her like a train of liquid darkness. "Thought their toys and trinkets would anchor their souls. But I found them all. Took what I needed. added them to my collection. The larger jars on the walls began to glow with a pale, sickly light. Through the dusty glass, Rebecca could see their true contents, swirling masses of shadow and light, each one containing the essence of a stolen child. "You're a monster," Rebecca whispered. "I am a scientist, a pioneer. These children," she gestured to the shadows that had once been Morris, now taking shape as another twisted form. "They serve a greater purpose. Their sacrifice advances the boundaries of human potential." The temperature dropped further. Ice crystals formed on the jars, creating patterns that looked like screaming faces. The shadows reached for Rebecca with hands made of stolen darkness. But she was ready. While the sister monologued, she had found what she needed in the journal, the formula's one weakness. Salt and iron, blessed by innocent faith. Her hand closed around the rosary in her pocket, the one that had belonged to her grandmother. "You forgot something," Rebecca said. "These children may have been afraid, but they were also believers." She threw the rosary. It caught Sister Mary Catherine across the face, the blessed metal sizzling against her skin. The nun screamed, a sound like breaking glass and tearing metal. The shadows recoiled. The jars began to crack, leaking light and darkness. Rebecca started whispering, not a prayer, but the names of every missing child, read from the journal's meticulous records. "No." Sister Mary Catherine's form began to waver, her perfect face melting like wax. "My collection. My precious elements." The jars shattered one by one, releasing their captured souls. The shadows took shape, children forming from darkness and light, their faces becoming human again as their names were spoken. Sister Mary Catherine's body began to age rapidly, decades catching up in seconds. The shadows that had been her cloak turned on her, flowing into her mouth, her eyes, her very pores. Her screams echoed through the hidden laboratory as her collection reclaimed what she had stolen. When it was over, nothing remained of Sister Mary Catherine but a habit full of darkness and dust. The children's souls faded away like mist, finally free after 60 years of captivity. The demolition team found Rebecca in the hidden laboratory the next morning. The jars were all empty now, their contents released. But they found something else, hundreds of small toys and trinkets, each one a precious thing that had anchored a child's soul, protected it from complete consumption. They buried the objects with proper ceremony. The orphanage was demolished, its secrets sealed beneath new construction. But sometimes, late at night, people say they can hear children laughing in the empty lot, not in fear, but in joy. Free laughter, released laughter. The only thing they never found was Sister Mary Catherine's formula. Rebecca had burned the journal, watching the pages curl and blacken, taking their poisonous knowledge back into darkness where it belonged. Some mysteries, she decided, should remain forgotten. Some hungers should remain unfed. Some orphanages should stay buried. That was the last of today's haunting tales. If you want to discover more mysterious stories like these, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell icon so you don't miss our upcoming stories about mysterious guardians, cursed objects, and family secrets that should never see the light of day. Let me know in the comments which of the stories impacted you the most and why. Next week, we'll be back with new stories that will keep you glued to your screen. See you in the next video.